Picture this: November 25, 1892, a cold autumn night in Newport, Rhode Island, and the first breaker's mansion is ablaze, flames tearing through the Queen Anne-style wooden structure like a vengeful god reminding mortals of their vulnerability, the family and guests fleeing into the darkness as years of accumulated treasures turn to ash and smoke, the entire fortune-built edifice reduced to smoldering ruins by morning, and standing among the wreckage, watching his family's summer retreat destroyed, is Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the dutiful heir, the responsible son, the man who inherited not just his grandfather's railroad empire but the crushing weight of expectations that came with the most famous name in American capitalism, and in this moment of catastrophic loss, rather than retreat, rather than accept defeat, he makes a decision that will define the remainder of his short life and crystallize everything excessive, everything beautiful, everything tragic about the Gilded Age. He will rebuild, but this time he will build something fireproof, something that announces to the world that the Vanderbilts are not merely rich but invincible, something so grand that it will make every other Newport cottage look like a garden shed, and this decision, born from pride and fear and the desperate need to prove something that perhaps could never be proven, will result in the breakers we know today. A 70-room Italian Renaissance palace that cost somewhere between $7 and $12 million to construct, the equivalent of $260 to $350 million in current dollars, employing hundreds of European craftsmen and American laborers for 2 frenzied years, creating a monument so spectacular that it would become synonymous with Gilded Age excess, yet this glittering achievement would come at a price far steeper than its construction costs, because what burns fastest in America isn't wood but inherited wealth, and what this story reveals isn't just how one man built a palace but how that palace helped drain a fortune that took 3 generations to build and barely 2 to destroy. And if you listen carefully to the wind whistling through those 50-foot ceilings and echoing down those marble halls, you can hear the darker truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge at those glittering parties, that the Breakers was never truly a home but a performance, never truly a retreat but a battlefield, never truly about leisure but about an exhausting, relentless, ultimately futile war against time, against social rivals, against the mathematics of compound spending, against the simple fact that in America even the mightiest empires are built on sand. And this is the story of how one wildly expensive dream became a beautiful cage, how duty became burden, how ambition became doom, and how the grandest mansion ever built in America became the symbol not of triumph but of the inevitable reckoning that awaits everyone who believes that money can purchase permanence, that architecture can defeat mortality, that any amount of marble and gold can insulate a family from the cruel arithmetic that governs all fortunes. 3 generations from shirtsleeves to shirtsleeves, boom to bust, empire to echo. And it all begins not with triumph but with ashes, not with celebration but with fear, not in sunlight but in the smoke-filled darkness of that November night when everything burned. To understand why Cornelius Vanderbilt II would make such a catastrophic decision, you have to understand the man himself, and to understand the man, you have to understand the family, and to understand the family, you have to understand that being a Vanderbilt in the 1890s wasn't about freedom or joy but about duty, obligation, performance. The suffocating weight of a name that opened every door but also imprisoned everyone who carried it, because Cornelius II, known as Cornel to distinguish him from his legendary grandfather, was born in 1843 into a world of contradictions, where his family possessed staggering wealth but was still considered nouveau riche by New York's old money aristocracy, where they controlled the nation's most powerful railroad but were excluded from Mrs. Astor's fabled 400, where they could buy anything except the one thing they desperately wanted, acceptance, legitimacy, the security of knowing that their place in society was fixed and unassailable, and this hunger, this gnawing sense of being perpetually on trial, shaped everything about how the family operated, turning every mansion into a statement, every party into a campaign, every expenditure into ammunition in a war without end. Cornelius II was the eldest son of William Henry Vanderbilt, who himself was the eldest son of the Commodore, the original Cornelius Vanderbilt, the self-made titan who built the family fortune from a single ferry boat into a shipping and railroad empire worth $100 million at his death in 1877, making him the richest man in America and one of the richest in the world. And the Commodore had been, by all accounts, a terror, brilliant, ruthless, profane, a man who crushed competitors without mercy, who manipulated markets with the skill of a master puppeteer, who built his empire through a combination of genius strategy and absolute willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way, and he had left the bulk of his fortune not to his 8 daughters or his younger son Cornelius Jeremiah, who he considered weak and ultimately died by suicide, but to William Henry, whom he had initially dismissed as slow-minded and unworthy but who had proven himself through years of grinding railroad management, demonstrating the same ruthless competence that had made the Commodore successful, and William Henry had, in just 8 years between 1877 and 1885, doubled the family fortune to $200 million, making him the richest man in America, but he had also borne the crushing pressure of managing an empire under constant public scrutiny, dealing with labor strikes, fending off competitors, navigating the treacherous politics of railroad regulation, all while maintaining the massive New York Central Railroad system that was the foundation of Vanderbilt power. And when he died in 1885 at age 64, exhausted, overweight, his health destroyed by stress, he split his fortune between his two eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam, Willie K., with each receiving roughly $65 million, making them among the richest men in America. But this division created immediate complications because it was unclear who was actually head of the family, who carried the primary responsibility for managing the railroad empire, who bore the weight of the Vanderbilt name. Cornelius II believed, perhaps correctly, that as the eldest son he was the rightful heir, the one who should manage the family business and represent the family in society, and he had spent his entire life preparing for this role, working since age 16 in small banks to learn finance, then joining the railroad management, learning every aspect of the business with the same dogged determination that had characterized his grandfather, and he had married in 1867 to Alice Claypool Gwynn, the daughter of an old Cincinnati family with impeccable social credentials, a woman who was everything the Vanderbilts needed, beautiful, dignified, connected to old money families, capable of navigating the treacherous waters of high society with grace and determination, and together they had 7 children, though one died young, and Cornelius had methodically built his reputation as the responsible Vanderbilt, the dutiful one, the one who showed up for work every day, who took the family obligations seriously, who understood that with great wealth came great responsibility, and this self-conception as the family's anchor, its moral center, its steady hand, would shape everything he did, including his fatal decision to build the breakers at a scale that would drain his fortune faster than the railroad dividends could replenish it. His brother Willie K., by contrast, represented everything Cornelius wasn't: fun-loving, social, married to the indomitable Alva Erskine Smith, who had forced her way into Mrs. Astor's inner circle through sheer audacity and the strategic deployment of millions, more interested in yachts and parties and the pursuit of pleasure than in the grinding responsibility of railroad management, and Willie K. was perfectly content to let Cornelius be the head of the family, to let him bear the pressure and the scrutiny, while Willie K. enjoyed his wealth without guilt, building his own monument, Marble House, right there in Newport. A $11 million wedding gift for Alva that featured 500,000 cubic feet of marble and interiors modeled after Versailles, and the relationship between the brothers was complicated, loving but competitive, supportive but jealous, united by blood and fortune but divided by temperament and ambition, and nowhere was this tension more visible than in Newport, where their 2 palaces would sit within sight of each other, each trying to outdo the other, each trying to prove something different about what it meant to be a Vanderbilt. Willie K.'s Marble House shouting, "Look at us, we're as magnificent as French kings," while Cornelius's breakers would whisper, or rather thunder, "Look at us, we're responsible stewards of immense power, building palaces that will last forever, that can't burn, that testify to our permanence and legitimacy." But here's what nobody understood at the time, what perhaps Cornelius himself didn't fully grasp: the Vanderbilt fortune, while staggering, wasn't infinite, and the costs of maintaining multiple massive estates, supporting extended family members, funding philanthropic ventures, and above all competing in the brutal social arms race of Gilded Age Newport and New York society, were eating away at the principal at an alarming rate that would become catastrophic when combined with the historical forces already gathering to destroy great fortunes: labor unrest, progressive era regulation, eventually income tax and inheritance tax, creating a perfect storm that would, within 2 generations, reduce the mighty Vanderbilt empire to a scattered collection of trust funds and painful memories. And the tragedy is that Cornelius, with his sense of duty and responsibility, was the one least equipped to recognize this danger, because he fundamentally believed that if he did everything right, if he built responsibly, if he managed carefully, if he performed his role as family patriarch with dignity and honor, the fortune would be secure, would last, would provide for generations yet unborn, and this belief, this faith in permanence, would lead him to make decisions that accelerated rather than prevented the family's financial decline, with the breakers standing as the most spectacular and tragic example of how wealth can blind even the most conscientious to the mathematics of their own destruction. Newport in the 1890s wasn't a place, it was a pressure cooker, a battlefield, a stage where America's wealthiest families waged social warfare with architecture as their weapons, fashion as their armor, and parties as their bombs, and understanding this context is essential to understanding why Cornelius would embark on such a wildly expensive rebuilding project, because Newport had evolved from a quiet colonial port into the summer capital of American high society, where the 400 retreated each season to escape New York's heat and to engage in the exhausting performance of leisure that was actually the most demanding work any of them did, governed by rules so complex and rigid that entire guidebooks were published explaining when to make calls, how long to stay, what cards to leave, what clothes to wear for different hours and occasions. The whole elaborate dance orchestrated by Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor and her court jester Ward McAllister, who had literally created a list of the 400 people who mattered in New York society, supposedly the number who could fit comfortably in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, and being on that list or being excluded from it could make or break a family's social standing, could determine who your children married, what clubs you could join, what doors opened and which remained permanently closed, and the Vanderbilts, despite their wealth, had initially been excluded because the Commodore was too crude, too self-made, too willing to say, "I don't care," in response to societal expectations, but by Cornelius II's generation the family was desperately trying to buy their way in, to use their wealth as a battering ram against the gates of acceptance, and Newport was where this battle would be won or lost. The first breakers, the one that burned, had been purchased by Cornelius in 1885 from tobacco magnate Pierre Lorillard IV for $450,000, about $15.7 million today, and it had been a substantial Queen Anne-style mansion designed by Peabody and Stearns, with sprawling grounds and ocean views, perfectly respectable but not exceptional, and the Vanderbilts had used it as their summer residence, hosting guests, making the required social calls, performing their role in the elaborate Newport pageant. But the fire in 1892 changed everything, because fires were the nightmare of every mansion owner in an age of wood construction, gas lighting, and primitive fire suppression, and the speed with which the first breakers was consumed proved how vulnerable even the wealthiest were to sudden, catastrophic loss, and Cornelius, watching his summer home burn, made a decision that would define him. He would build a replacement so fireproof, so substantial, so overwhelming in its architectural magnificence that it would stand as testament to Vanderbilt permanence, a monument that could survive anything, that would last for centuries, that would tell the world that the Vanderbilts weren't temporary, weren't vulnerable, weren't going anywhere, and this decision, born from trauma and pride, would lead him to commission Richard Morris Hunt, America's most prestigious architect, the man who had designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, who had built mansions for the Astors and other blue blood families, who understood implicitly what it took to translate wealth into architectural legitimacy, and Hunt, perhaps sensing both the opportunity and the danger in what Cornelius wanted, would design something so ambitious that it would push the boundaries of what was possible, what was practical, what was sane. Hunt's design for the breakers abandoned all pretense of being a mere summer cottage and instead created a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace inspired by the 16th-century Genoese palazzos, built on a scale that would have impressed the Medici, with exterior walls of Indiana limestone and brick, a structure composed entirely of masonry and steel trusses with no wood in the primary construction, making it genuinely fireproof but also phenomenally expensive and requiring construction techniques that were at the cutting edge of 1890s engineering, and the building would stretch 250 feet across its facade, rise 4 stories high, contain 125,339 square feet of space including multiple ballrooms, a music room, a library, a billiard room, elaborate family quarters, and servants' areas that were themselves larger than most substantial homes, all arranged around a magnificent great hall that soared 50 feet to a painted ceiling, and the interiors would feature marble imported from Italy and Africa, rare alabaster, gilt work by Parisian craftsmen, frescoes painted by European artists, columns and architectural details carved by Italian artisans brought over specifically for the project, mosaics, crystal chandeliers, platinum fixtures, and a level of elaborate ornamentation that would have been excessive in a palace but in a summer cottage represented something approaching madness, except that madness had a purpose, to prove beyond any doubt that the Vanderbilts belonged, that they had arrived, that they were permanent fixtures in American society who could command the same resources and demonstrate the same taste as European aristocracy, except they could do it faster, bigger, more spectacularly, because this was America, and in America we didn't merely match old world standards, we exceeded them, we overwhelmed them, we built bigger and faster and with more audacity than any duke or prince could imagine, and the breakers would be the ultimate expression of this American ambition, this refusal to accept limits, this belief that with enough money and will you could build anything, achieve anything, become anything. And the fact that this belief was fundamentally wrong, that it would ultimately destroy the family that embraced it most completely, makes the story all the more tragic and all the more American. The construction of the breakers between 1893 and 1895 was itself a spectacle, a demonstration of American industrial might and organizational capacity applied to a single family's summer retreat, because Hunt, working with Cornelius's obsessive attention to detail and unlimited budget, assembled what amounted to a small army of workers. Local construction crews handling the basic masonry and steelwork, Italian stonemasons brought over to carve the elaborate limestone details and columns. French craftsmen to create the gilded surfaces and decorative elements, fresco painters from Italy to create the ceiling murals, artisans specializing in mosaic work, plasterers, carvers, metalworkers, each with specific skills required for different aspects of the elaborate design. And managing this international workforce while meeting Cornelius's demand for fireproof construction created logistical nightmares that pushed everyone involved to their limits, because fireproof meant more than just avoiding wood. It meant that even the doors would be reinforced, that the main boiler would be located 350 feet away from the house in its own underground structure, connected by a brick-lined tunnel so that even if the heating system exploded it couldn't damage the main building, that every possible fire hazard would be eliminated or isolated, creating a fortress disguised as a pleasure palace, and the costs mounted relentlessly as each new challenge revealed itself, as materials had to be sourced from around the world, as craftsmen demanded higher wages to work faster, as the construction schedule compressed into just 2 years because Cornelius, his health already beginning to fail, wanted to enjoy his creation as soon as possible, and so the work proceeded 7 days a week, from dawn until dark, with construction crews working in shifts, and the sound of hammers and chisels and the smell of fresh mortar became constants in Newport, visible proof that something unprecedented was taking shape on that clifftop overlooking the Atlantic. The mansion's exterior, while impressive, was almost restrained compared to what lay inside, because Hunt understood that in Newport you couldn't be too obviously nouveau riche, couldn't be too flashy, had to maintain a certain dignity and taste even while spending unconscionable amounts, and so the limestone facade featured classical proportions, elegant columns, restrained ornamentation that suggested power without shouting it, but once you passed through those bronze doors, themselves masterpieces commissioned from Carl Bitter, you entered a world designed to overwhelm, to stun, to leave visitors literally speechless at the scale and opulence of what they were seeing, and this was intentional because the Great Hall, the first space visitors entered, was Hunt's architectural weapon, a space that soared 50 feet high with massive limestone columns supporting the upper floors, the ceiling painted with clouds and classical scenes by French artist Paul-Jacques Baudry, the floor an elaborate mosaic of colored marble, and the scale deliberately designed to make even the wealthiest visitors feel small, to remind them that whoever could build this, whoever could afford this, was operating on a level beyond their understanding, and from this central space radiated the various public rooms, the music room paneled in gilt and featuring platinum leaf details, the library with carved oak panels and ceiling paintings depicting mythological scenes, the dining room seating 34 guests under 50-foot ceilings with rose alabaster columns, massive crystal chandeliers, and red damask walls, each space more elaborate than the last, each designed by different European craftsmen working in different styles but unified by an overall aesthetic of overwhelming magnificence, and the morning room featured platinum leaf ceilings, and the billiards room had walls of Cipollino marble, and everywhere you looked there were details that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime, a single chandelier costing tens of thousands, door handles cast in bronze and plated with gold, mosaic floors featuring semi-precious stones, carved mantels imported from Italian palaces, and the overall effect was intended to be that of walking through a museum or palace rather than someone's home, which of course was exactly the point, because the Breakers wasn't really a home, it was a statement, a declaration, a architectural manifesto that said, the Vanderbilts have arrived and we're never leaving. But here's what makes this story darker, what transforms it from a mere tale of excess into something more troubling. While Cornelius was spending millions creating these spectacular public spaces where he could perform his role as American aristocrat, where he could host Mrs. Astor and the Prince of Wales and all the people whose approval he desperately sought, the actual machinery that made this performance possible was deliberately hidden, made invisible, erased from the official narrative of the house, because the Breakers was designed with elaborate servant quarters, with hidden staircases, with an entire infrastructure of tunnels and passages that allowed dozens of staff to move through the house without being seen by guests, maintaining the fiction that luxury simply appeared, that comfort was effortless, that the family's needs were met by magic rather than by the invisible labor of cooks, maids, footmen, laundresses, coal deliverers, maintenance workers, groundskeepers, and all the other people whose existence was acknowledged only when something went wrong. And this architectural segregation, the servant stairs hidden behind panels, the working areas relegated to the basement and third floor, the elaborate tunnel system allowing coal and supplies to be delivered underground so that no tradesman would sully the main approaches, reflected not just the social hierarchies of the age but something more troubling, the belief that wealth should appear effortless, that the labor supporting it should be invisible, that the wealthy and their guests should be able to enjoy luxury without ever confronting the human cost of producing it, and this willful blindness, this architectural erasure of the working class that made everything possible, would come to haunt the mansions of Newport when, in later decades, historians and tour guides began telling the full story, revealing that below-stairs world where servants slept in cramped quarters, worked 14-hour days, earned perhaps $20 a month, and were expected to remain invisible ghosts serving the whims of people who spent more on a single party than the servants would earn in a lifetime. And the contrast between the gilded public spaces and the stark servant quarters, between the elaborate family bedrooms and the tiny attic rooms where maids slept, between the endless food at dinner parties and the simple meals servants ate in their own basement dining room, revealed the moral rot at the heart of Gilded Age society, the casual cruelty that allowed people to consider themselves good and moral while perpetuating a system of exploitation that differed from slavery primarily in that the workers could theoretically leave, though where they would go and how they would survive were questions the wealthy never troubled themselves to answer. The servants' world in the breakers was accessed through separate entrances, through back doors and side doors that allowed them to come and go without being seen from the main house, and once inside they navigated their own parallel universe of narrow staircases and plain corridors, moving through the house like ghosts, appearing exactly when needed with fresh towels or food or firewood and then vanishing again. And the logistics of running the breakers required a small army. There were the personal servants for family members, the ladies' maids and valets who handled clothing and personal care, the housemaids responsible for cleaning the endless rooms and maintaining the elaborate furnishings, the kitchen staff who prepared multiple elaborate meals daily, the footmen who served at table and answered doors, the butler who managed the entire household staff with military precision, the groundskeepers maintaining the 13 acres of manicured gardens and lawns, the coachmen and later chauffeurs handling transportation, the laundresses washing and ironing the mountains of linens and clothes, and all of these people had to be housed, fed, paid, managed, their labor coordinated so that the family and guests experienced seamless service, so that needs were anticipated and met before they were even expressed, so that the wealth could perform its primary function, allowing the wealthy to live as if labor didn't exist, as if comfort was a natural state rather than something produced by the invisible hands and aching backs of working people, and the annual cost of maintaining this army of servants, of keeping the gardens manicured, of heating the enormous house during the short Newport season, of maintaining the elaborate furnishings and artwork, ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, meaning that the breakers wasn't just expensive to build but ruinously expensive to operate, a constant drain on the Vanderbilt fortune that continued year after year, season after season, whether the family was in residence or not, because you couldn't just shut down a palace, it required constant maintenance, constant staffing, constant vigilance to prevent decay and deterioration, and this operational cost, multiplied across the multiple mansions the family maintained, the city house in New York, the breakers in Newport, other properties, was eating away at the fortune faster than most people realized, faster than perhaps even Cornelius realized, because he was trained to think in terms of railroad revenues and investment returns, not in terms of the corrosive effect of spending millions annually on mansions that generated no income, that existed purely for social performance, that were investments only in the most abstract sense of purchasing social capital that couldn't be sold or mortgaged when times got tough. The grand opening of the breakers in August 1895 was everything Cornelius had hoped for, a triumph of American architecture and engineering, proof that the Vanderbilts could compete with any European aristocrat in terms of taste and magnificence, validation that his decision to rebuild had been correct, and the house was immediately recognized as the most spectacular residence in Newport, surpassing even Willie Kay's marble house in scale and grandeur, becoming the de facto symbol of American Gilded Age excess. And Cornelius and Alice hosted elaborate parties, inviting Mrs. Astor and all the other social leaders, opening their palace for the endless round of dinners and receptions and teas that constituted Newport society, and the house performed its function brilliantly, providing the stage on which the Vanderbilts could play their role as American aristocracy, hosting visiting European nobles and American plutocrats, welcoming the Prince of Wales, future King Edward VII, who stayed as a guest and validated the family's arrival at the pinnacle of international society, and for a brief moment it must have seemed like Cornelius had achieved everything he sought, social acceptance, architectural immortality, a visible symbol of Vanderbilt power that would last for generations, but this triumph would be pathetically brief because Cornelius's health, undermined by years of stress and overwork managing the railroad empire while also performing his social duties, was failing rapidly. And the very summer the breakers opened, he began experiencing the symptoms that would lead to his first stroke. In 1896, just 1 year after the breakers was completed, Cornelius suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair, and suddenly this magnificent palace became not a pleasure dome but a cage, the endless stairs that had looked so grand now mocking his disability, the elaborate social events he had built the house to host now impossible. for him to fully participate in, and he spent the last 3 years of his life as a semi-invalid, watching from the sidelines as Alice and their children used the house he had built, and one wonders what he thought during those years, whether he questioned his decision to spend so lavishly on architecture, whether he calculated the cost of his grand gesture and wondered if the money might have been better spent securing his children's futures, whether he understood that the fortress he had built against fire and time was powerless against the biological realities of stroke and aging, whether he grasped that all his careful planning and responsible stewardship had been undermined by the one decision where he had abandoned prudence in favor of pride. But these questions, if he asked them, went unrecorded, and on September 12, 1899, at age 55, Cornelius died of a cerebral hemorrhage at his New York mansion, having barely enjoyed the great palace he had bankrupted himself to build. Having spent 4 years as an invalid after a lifetime of dutiful service to the family business, and his death marked not just the end of a life but the beginning of the slow unraveling of the Vanderbilt fortune, because Cornelius, for all his flaws, had been the responsible one, the one who understood that wealth required stewardship, and without him the family would lack an anchor, would drift toward the rocks of excessive spending and poor decisions that would characterize the next generation's management of the fortune. Cornelius left an estate valued at roughly $70 million, which sounds enormous but represented a decline from the $65 million he had inherited just 14 years earlier, meaning that despite all his careful management, despite all his railroad experience, despite his reputation for responsibility, he had actually lost money, had failed to grow the fortune, had barely kept pace with inflation while spending lavishly on mansions and supporting an elaborate lifestyle, and this was the first clear signal that the Vanderbilt fortune wasn't infinite, wasn't growing fast enough to sustain the spending levels the family had normalized, wasn't going to last forever unless something changed, but nothing would change because the cultural logic of Gilded Age society demanded constant displays of wealth, constant competition, constant escalation, and to step back, to economize, to live modestly would be interpreted as weakness or decline, would result in social demotion that the family couldn't accept, and so the spending would continue, the mansions would multiply, the parties would grow more elaborate, and the fortune would continue its slow but accelerating decline, and the breakers, rather than securing the family's position, had accelerated this process, had demonstrated that even responsible Vanderbilts could be seduced into wildly expensive gestures that satisfied pride but undermined financial security, and the house would pass to Alice, who would outlive her husband by 35 years, who would watch as her children and then grandchildren struggled with the burden of maintaining the palace, who would eventually be known as Alice of the Breakers, her identity absorbed into the house in a way that seems tragically appropriate, as if she had been gradually consumed by the architecture, becoming just another decoration in the magnificent rooms, another relic of a vanished age. Alice Vanderbilt ruled over the Breakers with dignified authority for decades, maintaining the social calendar, hosting the required events, performing her role as Dowager Empress of Newport society, but the world was changing around her in ways that made her performance increasingly irrelevant and then absurd, because the progressive era was bringing new scrutiny to extreme wealth, labor unions were organizing, income tax was introduced in 1913, World War I would shatter the comfortable assumptions of the pre-war period, and by the 1920s the Gilded Age world that had produced the Breakers would seem as distant and foreign as the Middle Ages, and yet Alice persisted, maintained the house, kept the staff, lived as if nothing had changed even as everything had changed, and this stubborn maintenance of old forms in new circumstances makes her both admirable and pathetic, a woman who understood her role and played it to perfection even after the audience had left the theater, even after nobody cared any more about Newport society and Mrs. Astor's 400 and the elaborate rules of calling and card leaving that had once seemed so important, and she would live until 1934, dying at 89, having outlived not just her husband but the entire world that had made sense to her, having watched her children scatter, having seen the fortune that seemed so secure continue its inexorable decline, having presided over a palace that had become less a home than a museum of a vanished age, and her long widowhood in the Breakers serves as a perfect metaphor for the fate of Gilded Age wealth, persisting long after its purpose and meaning have evaporated, maintained by sheer stubbornness and the momentum of old money, beautiful but hollow, impressive but irrelevant, a monument to values and assumptions that nobody believed anymore except through force of habit. The Vanderbilt children, growing up in the Breakers and similar mansions, seemed destined to inherit the earth, to live lives of effortless privilege funded by the inexhaustible railroad fortune, but their actual lives tell a more complicated and often tragic story, because wealth on this scale, inherited rather than earned, combined with the social pressure to perform and compete, created people who were often deeply unhappy, troubled, searching for meaning in lives that seemed to have no purpose beyond spending money and looking beautiful, and you can see this in the stories of Cornelius and Alice's 7 children. There was Alice, who married but died young, barely experiencing adult life, there was Cornelius III, known as Neely, who scandalized the family by marrying Grace Wilson against his parents' wishes, resulting in his being effectively disinherited, an exile that haunted him for the rest of his life. There was Gertrude, who became an accomplished sculptor and founded the Whitney Museum of American Art, using her wealth for something genuinely productive but also suffering through an unhappy marriage and multiple affairs, finding in art a meaning that money couldn't provide. There was Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, perhaps the most glamorous of the children, a sportsman and yachtsman who lived for pleasure but died tragically in 1915 when the RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat, drowning in the Atlantic not far from the cliff where the breakers overlooked the same ocean. His death a reminder that wealth provides no protection against the catastrophes of history, no immunity from war and violence, no escape from mortality. There was Reginald, who lived fast and destructively, whose daughter Gloria would become the center of a sensational custody battle during the Depression, whose life demonstrated how inherited wealth could enable self-destruction rather than happiness. There was Gladys, who married a Hungarian count and lived in Europe, surviving into old age but watching her world dissolve in World War II. And there were others whose lives followed similar patterns of privilege mixed with varying degrees of dissatisfaction, dysfunction, and tragedy, and the common thread was that none of them seemed genuinely happy, none of them seemed to find the wealth liberating, all of them seemed burdened by expectations they couldn't meet, names they couldn't live up to, fortunes they were ill-equipped to manage, and their collective story reveals the curse hiding inside the blessing, the trap built into inherited wealth, the way that money that should provide freedom instead creates a different kind of cage, one with golden bars but a cage nonetheless, where you're expected to perform a role, to be someone, to justify the fortune through endless display, endless consumption, endless performance of wealth without purpose. The decline of the Vanderbilt fortune, which accelerated after Cornelius II's death, followed patterns that would be repeated across American industrial fortunes, patterns so consistent that economists would eventually identify them as almost inevitable, the shirtsleeves to shirtsleeves in 3 generations phenomenon that affects most great fortunes, and the mathematics are brutal. If the first generation builds the fortune, the second generation maintains it, usually by continuing to work in the family business, and the third generation spends it, having grown up wealthy, lacking the hunger and skills that built the fortune, trained only in consumption not production. Then unless the fortune is growing faster than the family is spending, and unless there are strong institutional controls preventing dissipation, the money will vanish. And this is exactly what happened to the Vanderbilts, because after William Henry's death in 1885 the fortune was split among multiple heirs, then split again, then again, each division reducing the individual shares, and simultaneously the spending accelerated because each branch of the family felt pressure to maintain the lifestyle, to build their own mansions, to compete with each other and with rival families, creating a kind of arms race where nobody could afford to back down without losing face. And meanwhile the original source of the wealth, the New York Central Railroad, was facing increasing competition, increasing regulation, increasing challenges from automobile and eventually air travel that would gradually erode its profitability, and the family's ownership stake was being diluted as stock was sold to cover expenses or distributed to multiple heirs, so the dividend income that was supposed to fund the lifestyle was declining even as the costs of maintaining that lifestyle continued to climb. And by the 1920s it was clear to anyone paying attention that the Vanderbilt fortune was in trouble, was being consumed faster than it could regenerate, and the breakers, along with the other mansions, went from being symbols of permanent wealth to becoming burdens, expensive white elephants that nobody wanted but nobody could afford to abandon without admitting defeat, without acknowledging that the great fortune was dying. The introduction of income tax in 1913 and estate tax in 1916 accelerated this decline catastrophically, because suddenly the federal government was taking a significant percentage of income and an even larger percentage of inherited wealth, and fortunes that had grown in a world without taxation were suddenly subject to annual erosion and generational confiscation, and the Vanderbilts, like all American plutocrats, discovered that while you could hide from social pressure, you couldn't hide from the IRS, and the government would take its share whether you could afford it or not, whether it forced you to sell assets or not, whether it broke up the fortune or not. And this forced liquidation, this mandatory shrinkage of great fortunes, was probably the single biggest factor in the disappearance of American dynastic wealth, because it meant that even if the heirs were responsible, even if they didn't spend extravagantly, the fortune would still decline simply through taxation, and the only way to prevent this was to either grow the wealth faster than government could tax it, requiring investment returns that were increasingly difficult to achieve as fortunes grew larger and regulatory oversight increased, or to convert wealth into tax-exempt forms, like charitable foundations, which is what the Rockefellers did but the Vanderbilts largely didn't, and the Vanderbilts, trained to think of wealth as permanent, as something to be displayed rather than protected, as a right. rather than a responsibility, were unprepared for this new reality and suffered accordingly, and the breakers, which had been built partly as a hedge against loss, fireproof, permanent, lasting, became instead a millstone, a constant drain, a reminder that architecture isn't wealth but merely frozen wealth, money transformed into marble that can't be liquidated without loss, that generates no income, that exists only to be admired and maintained, and the costs of that maintenance, the property taxes, the insurance, the staff, the repairs, the heating bills that would have supported a small town, made the mansion not an asset but a liability, something that demanded to be fed with money year after year while producing nothing except fading prestige and increasingly unwelcome attention from tax assessors and social reformers who saw the mansions as obscene monuments to inequality that should be torn down or repurposed for public use. The crisis point for the breakers came during the Great Depression, when inherited fortunes were being decimated by stock market crashes, when unemployment reached 25%, when breadlines stretched for blocks and desperate men sold apples on street corners, and the contrast between these suffering masses and the palatial mansions of Newport became not just noticeable but politically dangerous, making the wealthy targets of resentment and regulation, and several Newport mansions were abandoned. During this period, too expensive to maintain, too embarrassing to occupy, too valuable as real estate to justify keeping as private residences, and the breakers might have suffered the same fate except that Alice was still alive, still maintaining her routine, still insisting on her dignity, and her daughter Gladys, now Countess Secondii after her marriage to Hungarian nobility, recognized that something had to change or the house would be lost, and in 1948, in a decision that would have been unthinkable to her father and grandfather, Gladys opened the breakers to the public, allowing tourists to pay admission to walk through the family's former summer cottage, gawk at the opulence, marvel at the excess, and essentially rent the family's dignity for $1.50 per visitor, and this decision, while practical and probably necessary, represented a profound defeat, an acknowledgement that the Vanderbilts could no longer afford to maintain their palace as a private residence, that the public, who had once been rigidly excluded now had to be invited in as paying customers, that the fortress Cornelius had built to demonstrate permanence now survived only through the charity of strangers' admission fees, and the irony would have killed him faster than the stroke if he'd lived to see it, because opening to tourists meant acknowledging that the Vanderbilts weren't special anymore, weren't above the crowd, weren't living in a different world but were reduced to being tour guides in their own home, caretakers of a museum dedicated to their own obsolescence, and Gladys, who maintained residence in part of the third floor even as tourists tramped through the first and second floors, became a living exhibit, a relic, a ghost haunting her own house, which is perhaps the saddest possible fate for someone born into such privilege, to live long enough to watch your birthright become a theme park, your family history become a commodity, your private spaces become public spectacle, and yet this was the price of preservation, the cost of keeping the mansion intact, because without the admission fees there was no way to maintain the property, no way to heat it and staff it and preserve the elaborate furnishings, and so Gladys made her peace with this compromise, with this bargain that saved the house by transforming it into something her father would have found humiliating, and she lived until 1965, growing old in the servants' quarters of her childhood home, maintained by the very public she had once been trained to see as beneath her, and her story, like her mother Alice's before her, became inseparable from the house, as if the breakers had consumed multiple generations of Vanderbilt women, absorbing them into its marble and limestone until they existed only as footnotes to the architecture, as answers to trivia questions, as names on plaques explaining whose bedroom this was, whose portrait this is, whose fortune paid for all this glory that nobody wanted to live in any more because the costs, financial, social, spiritual, had become unbearable. In 1972, the final break came when the Preservation Society of Newport County purchased the breakers from Gladys's heirs for $365,000, a sum so laughably small compared to the construction costs that it perfectly illustrated how completely values had inverted, how what had once been priceless had become nearly worthless, or at least worth only a tiny fraction of what had been spent on it, and while the Preservation Society got approximately 90% of the furnishings as part of the deal, the purchase price alone wouldn't have covered even 1 year of the original annual maintenance costs, demonstrating how drastically the mansion had depreciated, how completely it had failed as an investment, how thoroughly Cornelius's dream of building something permanent and valuable had collapsed, because in the end the breakers wasn't worth maintaining as a private residence, could only survive as a public attraction, as a cautionary tale, as a monument to excess rather than achievement, and the Preservation Society, in taking ownership, essentially converted the house into a public heritage site, a museum of Gilded Age excess where visitors could see firsthand how the super-rich had lived, could marvel at the opulence and simultaneously judge it, could experience vicariously the lifestyle while also feeling superior to it, could tour the mansion while feeling glad they don't have to pay its electric bill or property tax, and this transformation from private palace to public museum, while saving the architecture, also fundamentally changed its meaning, converted it from a demonstration of power into a warning about power, from a celebration of wealth into a critique of wealth, from a symbol of arrival into a reminder of fall, and this inversion of meaning is perhaps the cruelest fate that could have befallen Cornelius's creation, because it survived but only by becoming the opposite of what he intended, by serving not the family's glory but as evidence of the family's ultimately tragic trajectory from the heights of American capitalism to the footnotes of American history. The Preservation Society's operation of the breakers as a museum has been hugely successful in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the original builders, because it turns out that people are fascinated by this kind of excess, want to walk through these rooms, want to imagine what it was like to live with this much money, want to experience vicariously the world of the Gilded Age, and the breakers now attracts over 400,000 visitors annually, generating millions in admission fees that fund not just the mansion's maintenance but the preservation of other Newport properties, making it financially successful in a way it never was as a private residence, and there's a deep irony here that the house only works economically when it's been stripped of its original purpose, when it's been converted from private display to public spectacle, when the family that built it no longer benefits from it except through historical association, and the tours that guide visitors through the mansion tell a story very different from the one Cornelius would have wanted, because modern tour guides don't just celebrate the opulence, they critique it, they contextualize it, they explain that this luxury was built on railroad monopolies and labor exploitation, they point out the servant quarters and talk about the invisible work that made the leisure possible, they discuss the costs not just in dollars but in human terms, in hours worked by people whose names weren't recorded, in social inequality that made this concentration of wealth possible, in the environmental damage caused by industries that funded these mansions, and this critical narrative, this willingness to see the breakers not just as beautiful but as problematic, represents a fundamental shift in how Americans think about wealth and power, a rejection of the idea that great fortunes are purely admirable, an insistence on examining the human and social costs of accumulation, and this shift, which would have horrified Cornelius and his contemporaries, is now mainstream, is how we teach our children about the Gilded Age, is the lens through which we view these monuments, and the breakers, built to celebrate Vanderbilt achievement, now serves partly to indict Vanderbilt excess, built to demonstrate permanence but now demonstrating impermanence, built to inspire awe but now inspiring complicated feelings that mix admiration with discomfort, appreciation with critique, aesthetic pleasure with moral unease, and this complex response is probably healthier and more honest than the uncritical admiration the builders expected, but it also means the mansion failed at its deepest purpose, which was to make the Vanderbilts seem not just rich but right, not just powerful but deserving, not just wealthy but wise, and that failure is written into every room, every marble column, every gilt surface, because no amount of beauty can ultimately justify the costs, can make the mathematics work, can prove that this was a good use of resources, can demonstrate that Cornelius made the right choice when he decided to rebuild on such a catastrophic scale. The deeper story of the breakers, the one that haunts its magnificent rooms like a ghost no tour guide acknowledges, is about what happens when a family confuses performance with substance, when wealth becomes its own justification, when the pressure to demonstrate status overrides every other consideration including basic financial prudence, and Cornelius Vanderbilt II, for all his genuine qualities, his work ethic, his sense of duty, his love for his family, made a catastrophic miscalculation. When he decided that the appropriate response to a fire was to build something that couldn't burn, when he allowed his fear and pride to override his judgment, when he commissioned a palace that would require more to maintain than the railroad could produce in dividends, when he confused building a monument with building a legacy, and the tragedy isn't just that he died too soon to enjoy his creation but that the creation itself, by its very existence and cost, helped destroy the fortune he was trying to preserve, helped accelerate the dissipation he was trying to prevent, helped transform the Vanderbilt name from a symbol of success into a cautionary tale about the limits of wealth, about how fortunes that seem infinite are actually quite finite, about how 3 generations from shirtsleeves to shirtsleeves isn't just a saying but a reality that even the mightiest family can't escape without vigilance and restraint and institutional structures that the Vanderbilts never built, and the comparison between the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers is instructive here, because the Rockefellers, who were richer than the Vanderbilts, managed to preserve their wealth across generations through careful planning, through trusts and foundations, through a family culture that emphasized stewardship over consumption, through investment in human capital and education rather than architecture, and the Rockefeller fortune survived and even grew while the Vanderbilt fortune evaporated, not because the Rockefellers were smarter or better, but because they understood something fundamental that the Vanderbilts didn't, that wealth is fragile, that it requires protection, that buildings don't preserve fortunes but proper planning does, that $1 million in a foundation will last longer than 10 million in marble, and this lesson, learned too late by the Vanderbilts if they learned it at all, is perhaps the most valuable thing the Breakers teaches today, not through what it celebrates but through what it represents, which is the ultimate futility of trying to buy permanence, the impossibility of using architecture to defeat time, the vanity of believing that any structure, no matter how magnificent, can protect a family from the ordinary mathematics of fortune dissipation, taxation, generational dilution, and simple human folly. When you walk through the Breakers today, what you're seeing isn't really the house that Cornelius built but a carefully maintained simulation of that house, because the original house was alive with people, with the family and servants and guests, with the smell of coal fires and kitchen cooking, with the sound of carriages and later automobiles, with the endless activity of a great household in operation, and what remains is a museum, beautiful but dead, preserved but lifeless, a snapshot of a moment that exists now only in amber, frozen in 1895, and this preservation, while valuable for historical and aesthetic reasons, also distorts, because it makes the mansion seem permanent when the whole point of the story is its impermanence, makes it seem stable when it was always unstable, makes the Vanderbilt fortune seem secure when it was already dissolving, and the very success of the Breakers as a museum obscures the failure of the Breakers as a home, as an investment, as a strategy for preserving family wealth and status, and tourists who visit today often leave with a sense of wonder at the beauty, at the craftsmanship, at the sheer scale of it all, without fully grasping that what they're looking at is the physical manifestation of a family's losing battle with history, with economics, with their own inability to recognize that you can't build your way to permanence, that architecture is mortal like everything else, that the proper response to a fire isn't to build something fireproof but to question whether you need to build at all, whether the money might be better used elsewhere, whether the performance is worth the cost, and these questions, which Cornelius never asked or never answered honestly, are the ones that haunt the house, that echo in the great hall, that whisper from the servant quarters, that rise from the underground tunnel where coal was delivered to feed the monster appetite of a house that existed not to shelter a family but to prove a point, and the point, it turns out, was wrong, was based on false assumptions about wealth and society and permanence, and the house stands today not as vindication of those assumptions but as evidence of their falsity, as a beautiful, elaborate, expensive mistake, as a monument to the limits of money, as a palace that bankrupted the prince, as the wildly expensive dream that helped destroy the fortune it was built to celebrate. The mathematics of the Breakers' failure are brutal when you actually calculate them. Construction costs of approximately $7 to $12 million, accounts vary, in 1890s dollars, equivalent to $260 to $350 million today, plus annual operating cost probably running $300,000 to $500,000 in period dollars. Roughly $10 to $17 million annually in current terms, for a house that was occupied perhaps 3 months per year, and if you compound these costs over the decades, if you add the opportunity cost of capital that could have been invested elsewhere, if you factor in the property taxes and insurance and endless repairs and updates, the total cost of the Breakers over the century probably exceeded $500 million in current terms, and what did this expenditure produce? A few seasons of social triumph for Cornelius, who enjoyed it for barely 4 years before his stroke and death, decades of genteel poverty for his widow Alice, trapped in a house she couldn't afford to abandon, a burden for subsequent generations who inherited not an asset but a liability, and eventually a museum that benefits the public and the preservation society but no longer serves the family that built it. And this is the real story of the Breakers, not a story of triumph but of the Pyrrhic victory that costs more than losing would have, the battle won that loses the war, the mansion built that helps bankrupt the builder, the palace that becomes a prison, the monument that marks not achievement but its own catastrophic costs, and if Cornelius could return today, could walk through his creation preserved in aspic, could see the tourists photographing his ceilings and marveling at his excess, could understand what happened to his fortune and his family in the decades after his death, one wonders whether he would feel vindicated or horrified, whether he would see the preservation of the house as success or the transformation into a museum as defeat, whether he would understand that his wildly expensive dream didn't bankrupt him immediately but set in motion a process that would bankrupt his heirs gradually, relentlessly, as surely as the tide erodes the cliff that the breaker sits upon, and whether he would finally grasp what he should have known all along, that houses don't last, that fortunes don't last, that families don't last, that everything beautiful is temporary and everything expensive is perishable and everything built to impress ultimately impresses only in its futility, in its presumption, in its pathetic faith that human will and wealth can overcome the basic facts of existence, which are that we're all mortal, all vulnerable, all subject to forces larger than ourselves no matter how Many limestone walls we stacked between ourselves and reality, no matter how much guilt we apply to our ceilings, no matter how thoroughly we fireproof our mansions against the flames that will eventually consume us not literally but metaphorically, economically, historically, reducing us from people to names, from names to captions, from captions to footnotes, from footnotes to forgotten. And the only immortality the breakers achieved was the immortality of the cautionary tale, the warning, the example of what not to do, how not to spend, what not to build, and this is perhaps the cruelest immortality of all, to be remembered not for success but for excess, not for wisdom but for warning, not as a model but as a mistake, beautiful and elaborate and meticulously preserved but ultimately a mistake nonetheless, the wildly expensive dream that became a nightmare, the railroad tycoon's folly, the monument that marks not a family's rise but the beginning of its fall. And if you listen carefully while touring the mansion today, if you stand in the Great Hall while the guide talks about the construction costs and the imported craftsmen and the fireproof design, if you look up at those 50-foot ceilings and imagine the fortune that went into creating them and maintaining them and ultimately losing them, you can hear, faintly, like wind through marble columns, the sound that Cornelius Vanderbilt II never wanted to hear, never admitted he could hear, the sound that all great fortunes eventually produce, the sound of wealth draining away, of inheritance dissipating, of empires crumbling, of dreams dying, the soft inexorable sound of money running out, of families running down, of gilded ages ending, and it whispers to everyone who will listen the same lesson that Cornelius learned too late and that we relearn every generation, that you can't buy permanence, can't build immunity, can't spend your way to security, that every fortune is temporary, every palace is provisional, every dynasty is doomed, and the only question is whether you'll recognize these truths in time to act wisely or whether, like Cornelius, you'll be seduced by the siren song of architecture, by the false promise of marble and limestone, by the belief that if you just build something magnificent enough, something expensive enough, something designed to last forever, you can defeat time and probability and the cruel mathematics that reduce all fortunes to zero eventually, and the Breakers stands today as testament not to the success of this strategy but to its failure, not as monument to triumph but as memorial to hubris, not as the home Cornelius intended but as the museum he dreaded, not as family seat but as public spectacle, and the admission tickets that visitors buy to walk through its magnificent rooms are paying not to see success but to witness the beautiful ruins of failure, the meticulously preserved evidence that even the richest American families are subject to the same forces that govern everyone, that wealth is no shield against mortality or foolishness or the simple fact that expensive things require expensive maintenance forever and few fortunes can sustain that burden across generations, and if there's a final irony to the story, it's that the Breakers has outlasted the fortune that built it, has proven more durable than the wealth it was designed to celebrate.